Hola y bienvenidos a la Tortuga Borrosa Podcast. El patrocinador de hoy es español, mal traducido. Disfruto de ser amigo de los panqueques y mi jardín está lleno de medusas. Oh, hi there. Didn't see you there. Because I'm losing it. Because people are supposed to sleep. And when they don't, they do whatever I'm doing now. So let's talk about tennis. So, Jannik Sinner, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's pretty good. He's not as good as Denis Shapovalov, I guess. You know, because when Denis Shapovalov wins a set of tennis, the world goes crazy. You know, I did too. I got pretty excited. It's what you want to see. You want to see players play their best against the top players in the world because it makes for really high quality tennis. You know, and Denis hung in there fairly well in that match. You know, him falling apart as things go on makes a bit of sense. You know, he's not really at Sinner's level most of the time. So, you know, him playing at that level is him elevating. And, you know, elevation's about physical output, about, you know, technical skills and reliable form. But it's also about attention span. You know, the best thing about Nadal's career was that he played every single point hard from the time he got on tour to the time he left tour. And, you know, it just gives you that ability to stay at a top level for longer because you've been cultivating it, you know. So Sinner has that in his pocket, was able to get through a tricky situation, you know, and it's just another notch in his belt that indicates that he's, you know, at a level that's above the rest of the tour right now, you know, except for Alcaraz and, you know, when he's healthy, Djokovic. So good win for him. Things are not getting any easier for him. He's not serving the best right now. He's kind of fidgeting with the technique. That's the report anyway. And doesn't have it ironed out yet. Plays Bublik now. I thought Bublik played the best match I've ever seen him play in the last round. He, you know, from the beginning to the end, he was extremely offensive. He didn't back off his shots. He made a crazy percentage of them also. He was able to really expose, you know, Tommy Paul had some, you know, physical issues. He wasn't completely healthy. He's still dealing with that abdominal injury. And, you know, you could see he was in pain. He gritted through it, fought his way to a fifth set. You know, I really have to hand it to Tommy. His athletic ability is such that even in, you know, a 70% state or 60% state, he's still able to fight, you know, against a guy who's playing incredible tennis. There are plenty of players in the draw who would not have won a set at all against Bublik the way he was playing. You know, the only issue I think for Bublik is that he's going pretty big on second serves, which works, but I think he's a little predictable when he goes big on those serves. It's always down the tee again. I think Jannik and his team will be sitting on that, kind of take that away from him, which will apply a little bit of pressure. You know, even when they leave something else open, when the player is sitting on the thing you want to do, it just creates a bit of tension because it's almost like they're forcing you to go somewhere else. And now, you know, you can get a little predictable. Bublik's toss is, you know, pretty hard to read. You know, he has tendencies, but pretty good variation on his shots. I think the big difference here for him as far as his chances is that, you know, he just played, you know, solid tennis for 4 or 5 hours against Tommy Paul. And, you know, even in that great run at Roland Garros, he wasn't always, you know, locked in. He played a few rough games, and against Tommy, I don't really think he did. He was the better player throughout, more able to create, able to dial up big serves and big moments. You know, and he's always gone to the drop shot, but he's starting to hit it really efficiently and, you know, follow it into net and make good choices behind it also, you know. And he's hitting all his shots with full conviction. Even when he has the open court, he's still very focused. It's, you know, a brand new level for him. It's what people were begging him to do for the longest time. You know, these players with a ton of talent, you want to see them thrive. You want to see them excel because you want to see it. It's interesting. That's what's great about sport, is to see how good people can really get. And, you know, tennis, when it's played at the high level, is wildly entertaining. I didn't turn off the Bublik Tommy Paul match for a good 3 hours yesterday. So, you know, I'm grateful for him putting on that performance. Grateful to Tommy for staying out there when he didn't feel his best. Seemed like he had, half a chance going into the fifth, but just didn't have much left. I think Bublik wins at least a set against Sinner. He's had, some moderate success against him. Sinner straight setted him at Roland Garros. He's 4-2 overall, but I think those numbers and, that result doesn't really factor in so much here because Bublik has reached a brand new level. I don't think he ever played this well before. Bublik did just beat Sinner in 3 in Halle on grass. Again, counting grass doesn't really work for me here because, he gets a big... I know Sinner won I know he won Wimbledon, but, grass gives a big boost to servers. So, that's slightly taken away here. Hard court is much easier to return on just because the bounces are very uniform. So, Shapo managed to split sets early. He almost went up a double break in the third. So it's hard for me to say that the Bublik is going to get shut out here. I see the total listed around like 33.5 games. It would be very impressive, I think, if Sinner can straight set Bublik in this form. If he does, honestly, I think he goes back to being a slightly strong favorite here. I think him and Alcaraz are, in my mind, 50-50 right now. Alcaraz has looked better, so far in the tournament. Sinner has some question marks. The Cincinnati final definitely gives Alcaraz some motivation. He's likely still looking to, exercise those demons from the Wimbledon defeat. And, he's won the tournament before. There's not a lot here to say that Sinner's just automatically going to beat him. Although coming into the hard court season, it did feel like he was, probably a heavy favorite to win most of the hard court majors going forward. So this match will say a lot. I don't see a quick way for anyone to beat Bublik right now. I don't see why he would unravel. The 5-setter will have him perhaps a little bit flat if the match goes deep. I think Sinner will be a little fresher, but at the same time, Bublik didn't really, his game didn't falter in the 5th set. He was able to pull away because of, Tommy's injury, but he also was still playing well. He was still hitting the ball hard. He was still serving big. He didn't look particularly gassed after the match. The post-match interview, he was in good spirits. Also very sharp and alert, with his commentary. And I think that's a good sign for players, when they're not, not out of it after a match. They're still, ready for more. So I think Sinner can win. Obviously, the things that he does well are the things that Tommy did well. Tommy, I think, very good at returning with his backhand when he's on defense. Very good at just floating the ball back, relatively low over the net. Not with a lot of topspin, though, when he's on defense. He's kind of just reflecting the ball. And Sinner tends to hit topspin, which is harder to create a next ball off of. The other thing is on the forehand, Tommy gets a lot of topspin on it, but he doesn't always hit it through the court. So it gave Bublik time to take full swings. When they were trading cross court with forehands, it felt like Bublik was able to put a little more spin, infuse a little more power, and Tommy was just kind of, looking to outlast him, outmaneuver him. Tommy was very straightforward with his approach. Played great, and was aggressive when he needed to be. I think Sinner can be aggressive more often. Bublik is hitting his backhand. He had a one-handed backhand pass on the run to earn a break point. I mean, he's just really, he can do anything at this point, and it's the right player to play Sinner. I almost wish he was somewhere else in the draw, though, because I think he could beat most of the other contenders if he plays like that. So I think Sinner wins in 4. He plays well at net. He's good at covering the drop shot. He, not serving great with the new technique, but I think he served very well, with the old one. And there's no reason he can't revert if he needs to. I think, the ability is there in a big moment. Also, being one of the best returners helps him a bit. Tommy returned well, but I think Sinner is a little more adept at driving the returns down the center, which can kind of make Bublik choose a shot. And, just the ideal player to sort of unravel him. I'm talking a lot, but I'm just saying the same thing over and over again. It's hard for anyone to really beat Sinner at this point. But this is as close, I think, as anyone in this side of the draw is going to get. So Sinner in 4 or 5. Musetti and Munar, have an interesting history. Munar just beat Musetti in Hong Kong. It was 2-6, 7-6, 7-5, so very close. He's 4-1 against him, although, the other wins were on clay. The one loss is on grass in 2023. Hard to really count that too much here. Munar seems good. He's fresh. Musetti got a pretty simple round. So did Munar. Quick match against Bergs. Kobali had to retire. So, both of them are coming in fresh. This should be a grind, I think. I expect another. Hong Kong was 3 sets. I think this will be 4 or 5 sets. Very tempting to believe in Munar here because of because he was able to win, because he's a little more aggressive with his shot selection when he does have chances on hard court. He's becoming an efficient hard court player. He has a pretty good serve. Musetti can be a bit passive. My issue with just giving it to Munar is that, I think Musetti's defense, longer form match becomes an important thing. I think he hits his forehand a little bit harder, when he ratchets up the pace. Just very close. I think I saw something like minus 200 for minus 227 for Musetti. I think it's a little lower than that, honestly, but I don't think it means that Munar is just automatically going to win. The win against Diallo was partially Diallo being injured. Faria, he's supposed to beat. Musetti, simple against Goffin. Pericard was a good win. Kobali's a good win too. I just think Musetti's ready to win this match. The stylistic issues will be on display, I guess. If you're 4-1 against somebody, there's a reason why. I just feel like at this tournament, players are, at different levels. Musetti's not having the best hard court season. He's not having the, greatest season ever, but I think he's better than he was in those past meetings. And Munar beating him on clay, a lot of that is about Munar just being more interested at those events. Not that Musetti's not interested, but he had a season where he played poorly because he was dealing with some breakup issues. He's had distractions off the court. Not in a bad way. I'm not faulting him. You don't have to care about 250s, when you're at the top of the game. And it's almost courteous to not, so other players can get ranking points and prize money. But there are some matches on tour that aren't really indications of who's actually better. So I do expect Musetti to come through there, but I would not back it for any significant. Guys, don't bet on tennis. That's silly. Don't do that. I know some of you are doing it. I guess I could talk more in depth about that. I'll probably try to make some other content to deal with that more. I think it's better to just talk about tennis here. But, there's just a great deal of uncertainty, and you're not as well informed as the people setting the prices, and you don't have inside information. And, professional tennis is very difficult to understand. I watched the tour all year round for many years. I've played racket sports at a professional or near professional level before, and I still, don't understand why some of the things are going to happen. And then when they happen, something simple as Vondrousova plays Paolini. The curve on her lefty serve makes it impossible for Paolini to get depth on her backhand returns, right? She has a short, compact swing. Great. That's something you can learn. You can see that and know that Vondrousova is generally going to always do well against Paolini. Now, she plays Rybakina today. You would think Rybakina's height, if you're adding things up, if you're adding variables, which I think is how people go into tennis betting a little more in depth. If you're adding variables, Rybakina's reach will let her do better than that. But she actually sent more of those into the net, I think, than Paolini. So, obviously she's not the best returner. She's tall and a little slow, but, slow for the top tier of professional tennis, not, just slow for a human being. But I just think things don't always add up as easily, and if you have any uncertainty at all, sometimes it's better just to wait and watch the match, and then you start to understand the pricing. You start to understand what the story being told is by all of it, and it especially helps to stop because your conceptions generally about what's going to happen are going to mirror a lot of the general public's. And, the books are looking to balance investment. So there's a sort of aspect there where you learn why you were wrong. It's like you're a fish and you're swimming along with all the other ones. And every once in a while that, that school wins, and then you swim into the shark's mouth because that was that day. So if there's uncertainty, it's just good to skip things. I think it also erodes the process to get things wrong. I think everyone will admit, the mental state that you're in after you lose a wager is significantly worse than the one you were in when you first made the wager. People go in thoughtful, they're looking for things, they're in a pretty good mood, they're reasonable about the values they're wagering, but then you lose and now it's, I need that back. It's, I want to bet more. It's, many people, whatever's in the account, they just want to set it on fire or double it, just get a result, get an outcome. And I think it's partially that, duration of uncertainty while you're watching and you're sitting on your couch and you're leaning to the left because you want your football team to get a stop. And it's just, it's a lot of extra stress. It's something, maybe people don't notice that it's affecting their decision making. Maybe they don't care. When you're frustrated, you don't really care. Anyway, that's not what this podcast is supposed to be about. I just think it's a very tricky thing to pursue even recreationally. And I think it's a net negative on most people's lives, even if you're saying I'm fine with this, with these results, or I'm gambling responsibly. I just think there are probably more interesting ways to do it. And it's one of the reasons we came up with the competitions on DeGens Club was to illustrate how difficult it is to turn a profit week after week, for our odds competitions. And also with the bracket competitions to show just how difficult it is to really predict tennis. We all follow tennis enough that you think you'd fill out a perfect bracket. Almost every week at the 250 level and the WTA side, the person I have in the finals loses first round. And I'm not jinxing them. It's just, stylistic matchups are very unique. Different players are motivated different weeks. We don't have all the injury information. Whatever. I'm dragging it. I'll move on. But, that's some of my thoughts. So, Felix has lost to Rublev 8 times, and he beat him once. To go back to the point from earlier, sometimes data points from the past are not great. Felix has had a lot of bad losses, a lot of stretches of very poor play. I don't think the Felix that was on display against Zverev is generally present on tour. That's how we want him to play. Very aggressive, very solid. I thought Zverev would win. Even though he has a weaker forehand, I think it's hard to beat, 2 wings with one. It's like Berrettini against, the big 3. Just hard to hit through them like that. And that's what it seemed like Felix was having to do, having to win points with his forehand because he couldn't with his backhand. What started to happen, though, is Zverev just couldn't deal with the pace when the forehand inside in. I think that's Felix's best shot. The forehand inside in was landing, and, Zverev is going a bit safe, trying to guide it cross court, but he also knows if it's too short, he's in trouble. So he started, just lifting on the shot and decelerating, and put a bunch of balls long, made a bunch of errors, started to get very predictable on the backhand too. At that point, I think he knows what I was thinking. He doesn't know what I'm thinking, obviously, but he knows that is the clear strategy for him to make it a backhand exchange because Felix is more likely to miss first. I think Zverev decelerated on that also, though. He was just, spinning the ball in cross court and hoping Felix would explode. And at that point, Felix is locked in. The player believes they have a chance. I think you see this with some other players too. In a big match, when the match is close, Tiafoe's backhand becomes very solid. He hits it clean. In other matches, he'll try to do the other stuff. He'll go to slices. He maybe plays a drop shot because he's not entirely sure that the effort is worth it. You know, if you're going to hit 6 backhands and miss one against Medvedev, you kind of want to go with something else. But in that situation, you know, it's 5-all. You know, Felix has had some looks on Zverev's serve. Suddenly he's the one who's thinking he should just drive his backhand cross court. You know, suddenly he's the one with really nothing to lose in those exchanges either. So he can hit the ball a little harder, and if he misses, it's fine. And, you know, the same formula really where Zverev loses, which is he just gets passive, he gets nervous, and then, you know, he just doesn't execute, and he doesn't really deal with it in the best manner, you know, for a top player. So great win for Felix. I think it's, you know, the best he's played all year, and that gives him a decent chance against Rublev, because Rublev doesn't move great. You know, the 8-1 is, I think, about, you know, errors. I think Rublev can hit the ball big and trade power with Felix all day. He hits his forehand cross court really well, and he serves, you know, not as well as Zverev, but Rublev serves really powerfully. And I think, you know, Felix is not the best returner when the ball gets into him quickly. You know, he tends to just spin the ball in off his backhand sometimes, fights it off. You know, his forehand, he's better off with a full swing. I mean, who isn't? But, you know, I think Rublev is just able to trade with him and wants to. You know, they both play a similar style of tennis. So, you know, if Felix is not able to expose Rublev's movement, could be a long day. And, you know, the big difference between Zverev and Rublev is the forehand. Rublev's forehand is extremely dangerous. It's where he wants to hit the ball. He wants you to go inside in because he's able to drag it cross court really, really well. You know, and Felix is not, you know, his forehand on the run towards the forehand side is not anywhere as near as useful as when he's on the run towards the backhand side. So I do think Rublev will win that. You know, as well as Felix's serving could take a while. Also, we saw Boyer and some other people make some inroads against Rublev. Obviously, Coleman Wong played the match of his life. Glad to see him doing well. You know, I thought his level was really high, but I backed off the belief a little bit because he entered into a new tier there. You know, a new tier of competition. It's I guess prudent to doubt things. Sometimes I don't really love picking the favorite to win, but I know that the underdog winning would be, you know, a massive event. And there aren't a ton of massive events. You know, there are upsets, a lot of upsets this season in particular on tour. I think the power dynamic has shifted. You know, Sinner and Alcaraz have cleared themselves out, and now everyone else is kind of scrambling for what's left. And I think a lot of players have seen, you know, the next gen guys lose often enough that they compete well against them. You know, there's not a clear dynamic of who's, you know, supposed to dominate. And I think a lot of players believe in themselves, you know, and obviously leaks on the tour and error issues with players get ironed out with every generation. So every generation that comes up, certainly in the WTA side, I'd say, you know, the juniors that come up now are way more complete. They all have, you know, a huge offense. They all hit the ball very hard, very clean. And they also have, you know, defensive presence and solid backhands. So, you know, it's great to see. I don't think tennis is played, you know, one of the reasons initially, look, gambling's bad. One of the reasons initially I got into tennis thinking I could make predictions was because it's not really played at an optimal level. So there are glaring leaks. There are stylistic issues that people are not fixing, you know, from previous generations. Some from these two, but it seems more information, more, you know, best practices for coaching and training are kind of ironing those things out. And while that makes it much harder to win on tour and maybe increases, you know, injuries or maybe increases the troubles with switching the ball every other week for sponsor money, I do think it makes tennis a better game overall, which as a fan, you know, is what I want to see. Obviously, tennis is harder to play professionally than something like racquetball. But, you know, if you look at some of the top racquetball players, you know, their game almost looks maxed out. You know, if you look at somebody like Kane with Selnichuk, you know, you can watch him play all day. And actually, I'm realizing that's not a great example because he's the number one and he wins all the time, you know, and he is a bit far ahead of the other players. I just think that that's the level of tennis you sometimes, you know, you want to look at. You know, I think a lot of players, even guys like Khachanov, you know, in the past were sometimes pretty generic. And I think now they're getting their game more together, and the experience for the young guys too is making them good. Whatever, I'm yapping, but tennis is good, and I like Rublev in 4 sets. De Minaur and Reedy, De Minaur should beat him. Leandro got a great bonus there with Madrazek retiring. That's hard to see, because he just worked his way back on tour. Hopefully it's minor, and he can bounce back. Good decision, I think. He went out there to see if he could play. He couldn't. Pull the ripcord, go heal. There's a lot of tennis left this season, next season, so he'll be back. For now, I don't think Reedy can outlast De Minaur. I don't think he can bring enough offense to really earn the errors. Nothing to lose for him here. He could get to a tiebreaker, if Alex has a rough serving day. But, on quick hard courts, I tend to think Alex will just outlast him. He's one of the best fake tests on tour. If there's something wrong with your game or your mobility or you make errors, Alex is just going to expose that. And, he's drifting through this draw nicely. At some point, someone very good is going to have to play a very good match in order to beat him, too. We've kind of written him off. Well, I'm not going to loop you into my dumb opinions, but I've kind of written him off of, from winning majors, major titles. Masters 1000 would be, I think, a great result for him at this point if he won any more. Or won. I'm not sure if he has one. I don't think so. But someone will let me know in the comments. Or I could Google it like an adult, but, I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to mumble and feel awkward. So, yeah, I like Alex there in 3. I think, Reedy's been playing guys with a lot of offense. Cerundolo is a player who's given De Minaur trouble before, but not totally healthy for that match. He beat Pedro Martinez, who's very scrappy and defensive minded, consistent like De Minaur, but not as fast, not as dangerous either. I think these courts help flat hitters a bit, and De Minaur's forehand is really effective here. So I like De Minaur in 3. I don't really, Altmaier got a set, but I think Reedy is even with the days off, is not really playing as well as the round he's in, I guess. It's a little mean. I don't know why I said that, but I said it. So, all right, well, that's the men's side. So I'm going to move on to the women's side. Don't look at that. Those are spoilers. Don't look at that. Ooh, Pegula Krejcikova. That's going to be good. All right, welcome to the section of the draw where it's really difficult to know what's going to happen. Kostyuk and Muchova is, a pretty new matchup. They haven't played each other before. Kostyuk had a scare against Parry. Muchova had a scare against Noskova. I think they have similar games, but go about it in very different ways. Muchova uses a lot of slices, big, heavy forehand, good defense, not really the, when you talk about Sabalenka and Rybakina, those players stand out as huge offenses, in a tier of their own. I think the tier behind them is Kostyuk and Muchova, and, players like Kristea and Pavlyuchenkova, who, you're not really thinking of them as acing people and just hitting clean winners, but they do hit the ball really big and they tend to dominate things. Anisimova, these players, I can put her in the top tier because the ground strokes are that good. I just think, these are very dangerous players when they're playing well, and Kostyuk's defense is pretty good when she wants it to be. My question here is it reliable, in a big moment? Has the slump, that she went through, set a standard of not really being prepared to summon your best tennis when you absolutely need it. Obviously she was able to get past Pari. Mukova's a lot tougher than Pari. I think I like Mucova here. I think she's a little more balanced. She can get a little passive. She can make some errors, but she seems to have gotten a little better every match. Noskova was playing really well, and Mucova still was able to pull away in that match. I think, her having more variety in her game, she kind of reminds me of like a WTA Andy Murray. Just everything is there. She's able to execute. You put her in a bad spot on a big point, and she hits a lob that's quality enough to make you hit another shot that's difficult. She's able to hit her forehand down the line well. She gets to net decent. Good hands at net too. Occasionally plays a drop shot. I just think the variety overall makes it hard to play against her in a big match. If you play her at a 250, maybe her going to a drop shot or her, not serving totally aggressively might, give you a chance to sprint past her. But I think in those big moments, a more measured and balanced game helps, because a lot of players tend to get a little frantic. So I am expecting Kostyuk here to get a little frustrated and just try to hit through her. And I don't think that will work. Could go to Kostyuk. Mucova looked vulnerable against, it was the round before against Kirstea. But Kirstea was actually peaking. So, to beat her was difficult. I think there'll be a couple changes in momentum, a couple breaks of serve. I'm not saying anything intelligent here, really, so I'm going to move on. I like Mucova to win. Could easily go to 3 sets. Both hit the ball really huge. And, if both players are hitting the ball huge, hard for any player to win, 12 games, in a row, on their own serve. It's just, going to be difficult. Every second serve, I think, is going to get really battered here. So, should be close. I like Mucova just for the mental aspect, and because, even though she's not completely active, I think, just a bit more experience here and, a safer way to play. Being able to slice the ball on big points, it just adds a little pressure to your opponent to come up with something, especially, when you can't go into Mukova's forehand too safely. Osaka Gauff should be really good. A lot of press coverage for this. Kind of accurate though. For the past couple seasons, the news in America will talk about Osaka matches, the same way they did with Tiger Woods when he wasn't really winning on the golf tour anymore. PGA, sorry. They talk about Osaka, and you want more balanced reporting. But, marketing dollars are big, and it is a story still. I'd say, you can roll your eyes at talking about players who aren't there. The same as when the book puts Del Potro in the futures markets at tournaments he's not even at because he's having wrist surgery. It's a little bit frustrating. But, the interest is there, is the part that I think is mirrored here. People are interested in Osaka. She's an interesting character. One of the greatest players. I think, the level when she was winning the U.S. Open, the level of tennis she was bringing and the sound that her serve was making is enough for me to wish, that she comes back and gets to a good level. I just saw her, she gave a really good interview in press the other day. I talked about it in the last one. I think that, Osaka just seems to be maturing a bit more here. I thought her take on Ostapenko was really, really solid. And she's playing well here. Dropping a set to Kasatkina isn't really something I expected, but, Osaka's not really the most consistent. I think that's kind of always been the matchup here with Gauff. Gauff's serve and forehand are not anywhere near as good as Osaka's. So when she's struggling, giving Osaka setups, the ball is on Osaka's racket. Osaka's able to, take advantage of that. Hits the ball hard enough, that she's able to hit winners on Gauff, even though Gauff is a great defender. But at the same time, the way that Gauff defends and her speed, will allow her to get the same exact set that Kasatkina got because, Osaka will make errors. She does put the ball into the net with her backhand. She does hit the ball long a couple times with her forehand. I think there's some mental battle there to balance aggressiveness with current state. She's definitely playing great tennis again, but I think, at a time, I think when you come back from injury or from pregnancy or from a layoff or anything, I think in your head what you used to do, but you can't quite execute it the same way. So it's tough to kind of find the balance, the balance there. So unforced error count is something obviously Osaka needs to keep down. Tennis analysis is pretty reductive. Everybody knows unforced errors are not great. Osaka retired in their last meeting in Beijing, but they had split sets. So I think that's very possible again here. Gauff is playing well. Got a simple, a good matchup for her as far as, threat level against Freck. Get to hit a lot of balls because Freck plays well from the baseline, but no real threat there because she doesn't really have the big serve. Doesn't really hit her forehand that big cross either. So not a big problem for Gauff. I do actually think Osaka can win this. If Gauff is able to beat her, it'll be with a new level. Grit and defense is really good. But I think Osaka's serving well enough this week that alone won't get it there. So I think, if Gauff can win this match, puts her back in the conversation for the title perhaps. Certainly, if they're having backhand exchanges, certainly, if Gauff is putting extra balls in play and they're landing deep, that'll be a big issue for Osaka to try to manage her, her control, and her accuracy. But, Osaka's playing well every round here. The win against Baptiste really impressed me. Beating Kasatkina is a good test. Kasatkina doesn't hit as hard when she's defending as Gauff. Gauff really drives her backhand well. Even if you put her, 6 feet behind the baseline and off the court, she's still sending the ball deep with enough pace that it's hard to ever get to net. But it's good practice to play Kasatkina because you get to hit a ton of balls. So I think sometimes the draw helps you out a little. And I do like Osaka to win there in 2 or 3. They've played a few times. Just to circle back real quick, they played a few times and, they've both won a few. None of them have been particularly lopsided. And I think that is just about, it's about who plays better in those big moments, whether Osaka executes or, whether Gauff does. Because certainly if Gauff serves well, I like her against everyone on tour. It just doesn't happen that often, and the forehand issues and the double fault issues have been there this week. So, maybe in a big moment she's able to rise, but big moments tend to have close games. So that one's going to be tricky. Anisimova with a good win against Jacqueline Christian. I thought that might be tricky. Christian seems to just have a complete game and be willing to play, even if she's up against it. So good result for her here. Almost made the second week. For now, Anisimova plays Haddad Maia, who really, will be happy with this. I feel like she's been in a pretty bad slump, losing constantly, and, still the 18th seed here, still in the top 30 in the world, and that's just, I'm a little confused. I'll have to look back and see where the results were. I know she had some deep runs last season, but, I guess those are going to drop off soon. Shouldn't win this match, but their most recent match was in 2023 in Adelaide. That's hard court, pretty similar conditions to here, and Haddad Maia won in straight sets, and she's playing really well. She just absolutely smoked Maria Sakkari. That match was a little different than this one is going to be. That match was about Haddad Maia just kind of being a wall, and Sakkari eventually would make a mistake trying to create at the end of rallies. Just really lost the plot with her backhand. Even, the final game of the match, it's the one where you really want to hit the court and see if they're going to crack. And Sakkari just hit, routine rally balls deep. She's not trying to do that, obviously. I think that happens a lot in doubles. You make an error and your partner wonders why you went for that shot. And it's like, I wasn't trying to do that at all. It's just hard to execute sometimes. And, that was the story for Sakkari. I don't think that'll happen to Anisimova. She just hits the ball too clean and is too comfortable. I was a bit surprised to see her, as a 4-1 favorite. But yeah, talking about it now, I guess that makes sense because, Haddad Maia won't get the things that she got from Sakkari, from Amanda. Amanda's playing fairly well. I just think Christian and Haddad Maia are, a similar level right now. So there's a chance this goes to 3. Haddad Maia is serving decent also. When she's playing really well, you can put her in the top 20 on tour, even though she's not the biggest, she's not the biggest threat in any department. She's not the fastest, doesn't hit the ball the biggest, doesn't serve the biggest, but she does all those things really, really well when she's playing well. So it's another player, similar to maybe Pegula, who, you can't really say exactly what she's going to beat you with, but she's doing everything well. And, when she's playing well, it's fun to watch. So I think Anisimova can win that in 2 close sets. Just a bit more capable on offense than the previous players. And I think Anisimova's backhand is really solid, which helps against a lefty. Alexandrova and Swiatek should be pretty good. Alexandrova won something recently. She won their second to last meeting in Miami. And, she's playing well. She's serving really well. Listen, zipping Siegemund is really impressive. Meanwhile, Swiatek probably should have been in the third set with Kalinskaya. Kalinskaya was up 5-2 in the first and just kind of lost the plot. She dropped back behind the baseline, which is interesting because I couldn't really gauge if Swiatek had just started hitting the ball harder or if Kalinskaya just kind of was fading. If I guess, Swiatek did start playing a little more consistently, but it just felt like early in the match, Kalinskaya was hugging the baseline and that was taking time away from Swiatek, which is the only way to beat her. And, it worked. And Kalinskaya hits the ball really clean. So when she lands it to the open court, you're in trouble, and she's very solid off both wings. Serves decent, but the serve kind of went away. Lost a rough tiebreaker and, played okay in the second set, but lost also. I think Kalinskaya's defensive ability is much better than Alexandrova, but Alexandrova serving well, very aggressive on the returns. If Alexandrova's up in a set 5-2, the set is going to end 6-2. It doesn't matter if it's Swiatek. This is a tough spot, and I'm not entirely sure. Given the Miami result, which again, those are, Miami's a little slower than the U.S. Open, I think, but similar conditions. The only thing I'll say is Alexandrova was like a special type of lights out that week on return. She was just really crushing returns, and this week it's been a bit more about, her serve on offense, just thriving. So Swiatek has made improvements on hard court since then. The deserved favorite here, but not really a safe zone. It's getting to the point where, listen, I'll talk about the tennis, but the upsets are not going to be in the form of players, crashing out unexpectedly. They're going to be in the form of, other players surging and playing a great match, and, the tension building for the players who are supposed to win. I just competed in a few events this weekend, and one of the things I found was that, in the situations where I was expected to win, the next few rounds, all of a sudden, every one of those matches became difficult, because you're fumbling, there's expectations, you should win this to get to the, to the real competition. And, that's a poor attitude. I'm sure Swiatek doesn't think about things that way, but I think, there is that added pressure for her here where Alexandrova can step in and rip the ball. And if she loses, she's disappointed. She's a little bit of a powder on the court, not an angry player, but she can get disappointed out there, but still not a lot for her to really lose here. This is a good result, ton of prize money, ton of points, playing a player who she has everything to gain if she beats also. Beating Swiatek, your tournament is complete. So I think this will be tough. Swiatek should be able to outlast her. One thing I saw, it was the match before Swiatek was having trouble on serve against Lamens, and honestly, looking at this scoreline, the past 2 rounds, it feels like Swiatek is going to lose. 3 sets with Lamens is fine, but not great. The thing I was going to say in that match was that she was struggling, to find first serves, and when she needed them, as the match progressed, she started serving better and better. So I think, same result against Kalinskaya, needed a better level, found it. Here she'll have to, though. You have to serve well to play a player who, is an aggressive returner and is in good form on serve. So just a tricky spot. I wish I were from the future sometimes so I could just tell you exactly what's going to happen. But, I want to say Swiatek in 3 because I think, she'll have to weather a storm at some point. And I think that she also is able to, move Alexandrova, especially on a big stage. Miami, I'd say also when Alexandrova beat her, yeah, it was a finals, but I think Swiatek is better, this season on faster courts than she was then. So I like her. Yeah, I think that's it. Getting to the point in the tournament where I can focus on matches, so probably have a bit more, useful info. I was a bit distracted this weekend. I was, mobile, so try to get something up in the afternoon tomorrow. So, all right, bye. Bye? This is a phone call? I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's happening. All right, adios.